At the end of my presentation, I want us to really appreciate that renting is a solution for Africa. So even as South Africa Development Bank, our payoff line is affordable housing for all in Africa. There's a very good book written by Adam Grant. It says, think again. So we need to think again about, is it practical to deliver housing for all in Africa? The panel here did not speak about 71% of Africans are renting. I had a very good meeting yesterday with the Minister of Mauritius, Minister of Housing. He said in Mauritius, 89% of the population own a house. They are very much privileged. In Africa, at a continental level, the picture is a bit different. So I will go through the slides, but what I want to achieve at the end is to demystify renting, and also to track where did it start, who popularized home ownership, and for what reasons. Okay, so build to rent as a panacea for solving housing affordability in Africa. I'm really going to cover this, a bit of theory, and the idea is to try and convert the thinking, demystify, and really be practical about it. Adam Grant would say, think again. Okay, so I will not waste time in terms of the housing context in Africa. Mark did a very good job. I wish he had mentioned that 71% of Africans are living in rented accommodation. I would have typically asked to say how many are living in rented, but I think because of the negative stereotypes, people will be thinking to say, should I not? So I will not do that. But I think everything here has been covered by Mark, the Knight Frank report. What I just want to emphasize is the third one, to say housing has a multiplier at a global level of 8 times. $1 spent in housing, the trickle-down effect results in $8 job creation, and I think the government of Kenya has really demonstrated this, especially working with the Joakal as well. And as South Africa Development Bank, we are looking at opportunities to work with the informal sector, SMEs. What I also want to emphasize is what is causing the 53 million housing deficit in Africa. The answer is very simple. We are having urbanization at a higher rate than urban economic growth. So the 53 million housing deficit is really a mismatch between urbanization, and I think someone spoke about it, in terms of we are having more people coming to the cities, but when you look at urban economic growth, it is happening at a lower level. So that mismatch is resulting in low disposable incomes, and housing affordability becomes an issue. So if you really want to resolve this thing, is to say, how do we re-engage our economies, especially the urban economy, to ensure that more people can afford housing. Okay. As well, I think this has been covered. I will just look at housing finance. I think one of the biggest issue is the mismatch between the tenor and also housing being a long-term. And I will further explain this as I talk about renting. Low disposable incomes, I've spoken about it, developer risk and diseconomies of scale. Across Africa, what we see, I will not mention a country, but we went there, we had a business development forum with what we were calling developers. We realized that these developers are really contractors. And you see the type of risk you take as a developer and as a contractor are totally different. So when you have someone calling themselves a developer, but they're a contractor, from a financing point of view, what it really means is they are taking a lot of risk. Both the viability risk, which is the developer risk, and also the on-site construction or execution. So it becomes very difficult. And also these developers, fairly small, which leads to fragmentation and also increase of risk. And banks' appetite, I'm very happy that Caroline is here, and also my sister Chege. What we have realized across Africa is commercial banks, their appetite for housing finance is a bit on the lower side, which is very much understandable. They are weighted capital, but also they look at it as high risk, especially if it's affordable. It's as if you are trying to sell something to someone who cannot afford. So those are some of the issues I just thought I wanted to talk about, but most of those things have been covered by Mark, and thanks Mark and Knight Frank for that. So let me now track where the negative stereotype, I know it's double emphasis, negative stereotype of renting started. So the misconception that everyone wants to own a house is not very correct. I'm very happy that my sister, the Gen Z here, spoke about it as well. And the challenge that we see, so this building we see here, as you shall see, was caused by, to a certain extent, rent controls. I'm happy that Shiv indicated that rental yields are growing. And that message is very important to mess as a pension fund, because if the rental yields are growing or improving, that really say rental can be looked at as a viable investment as well for pension funds and insurance money. So let me just take, I know this is, I'll run down in terms of, I had to take a step back to say what created this perception around rental. So 19th century, very much investment driven by markets, capital markets, where people were willing, pension funds, if you want, willing to invest in housing. After the First World War, which took a lot of money from the capital markets, and housing ran dry in terms of housing finance. After the World War, there was high inflation across the globe. What did it cause? It caused spikes in rentals. Rentals went up. And now people were looking to government to provide housing as a public good. Now, governments now were promoting to say, don't rent. Everyone should own a house. That's really where it started. It's like government were trying to deflect the responsibility around rental. But at the same time, government also responded. I will proceed in the meantime. Government responded by putting across rent controls. In most Africa countries, we still have these rent controls. Huh? Are we coming back? Okay. So the rent controls, what they did. So government, at that point, very much socialist across the globe. So government was looked as the bigger brother, protecting the poor, and by putting in place rent controls. In certain instances, these rent controls were even backdated 2 years and go forward for another 2 years. So what it meant is investors were no longer willing to invest in just call it housing. Huh? At that point, a lot of rental housing hibernated into the informal sector. And up to now, those slums that you see, there's a big landlord who is renting out small units to people. So it's happening in the informal sector. Part of it is to run away from the taxes and fees. And to an extent, it's then seen as a high profit business because they're not paying taxes. What also this caused is urban decay, because property owners were not really motivated to reinvest in an asset where the rent is being controlled, not determined by the market. What also the panel here did not say, I'm not trying to change the narrative. What they did not say is the move around home ownership, it causes urban sprawl. Because when you want a house, you see, you have certain requirements, you don't want to live in an apartment, you want your own. So it's also resulting in a lot of urban sprawl. Caroline spoke about urban planning. We used to have green belts surrounding our cities. What we see now is those green belts have been eaten by housing following the home ownership through governments. African governments, they have really been doing much in terms of promoting the last point. All these things are resulting in negative urban management issues where they are subdividing land, some of it right in the green zones, green belts, and extending infrastructure. But when you look at rental, it's very much vertical development, which is also climate friendly. Then moving on, this wisdom was given by UN Habitat in 2003. Unfortunately, a lot of governments did not follow. Very happy to say Morocco is one of the countries across Africa that really looked at their rental market. and really changed the housing laws to make sure that rental is viable, how removing the rent controls, making sure that rent increases is not illegal, which is in most countries very much inspired by the socialist movement. So these are some of the things that when you look at government's view, they think rental housing is very expensive budget item. They also think it's cumbersome to manage until many legal and regulatory frameworks. I'll move on. What are the importance of rental housing? I think again it's about saying, yes, we have this perception that we have, but let's stand back and say, if we have 71% of all Africans living in rental housing, we need to look at it and say, how can we improve the conditions within rental housing? How can we move rental housing from the informal markets to the formal market, formalize it, and actually have pension fund money? Even in the developed countries, 56% in the Western world, they are living in rental accommodation. The luck with it, when you look at the UK, most of these are owned by institutional companies. How have they managed to achieve it? Because they've made rental as an investment viable through the rent regulations. So these are some of the importance. So the first one is really about affordability to buy a house. Yes, it's a good dream. It's the biggest purchase anyone can ever have. But the truth of the matter is the affordability issues, the down payment. Then the second one, given the globalization, people moving around working, rental provides flexibility. The other thing is most households, their biggest investment is in the house that they are living. But if we can put in place a very viable housing, rental housing framework, it means you release that capital tied in that house, rent and invest in other things as well. In summary, rental housing offers mobility, flexibility, in terms of you don't tie your capital in that house you're also living, lower investment and also reduced commitment. You see, when you make a decision which seat you want to work in and you own a house in seat A, the decision making in terms of should I move to other seat, in most cases it's around the house now. So it decreases flexibility, and this really talks to Gen Z as well and the modern economy going forward. Okay, the next slide. Now I want to talk around financing of rental housing, because when you look at the appraisal, typical developers, when you are looking at when you are building to sell, typically you use the residual approach of appraisal, where you put your total development cost, you look at the gross development value, and the difference is your developer profit margin. When you look at rental housing, the approach to appraise now is slightly different. You are really using the NPV or the internal rate. In most cases, I'm very much aware that the model then have issues, because I'm happy Chief spoke about rentals going up. That would then improve the financial appraisal of these projects. But in most cases, viability issues crop up. And most governments, I've picked Morocco, the affordability gap, I would call it, where you have a certain rental that is being paid. If you put that rent in your financial model, the whole project is not viable. So governments can come through both on the supply side and also on the demand side. And I think the Kenyan government has done very well providing land. The cost of land is zero. So when you look at a typical appraisal model, your land cost is zero, and so is the finance cost of acquiring that land. They're also doing infrastructure financing, so that then helps. So those are the supply side as subsidies I'm talking to. In certain cases, other governments also actually put some monetary value to it as well. Then the demand side, subsidies. In most cases for civil servants, government actually provide a housing allowance. What they are trying to do is to bridge the gap between the rent, the market rent needed for this to be viable, and the rent that someone can afford. So it's topping up that rent to ensure that rental housing is also affordable. Demand-side subsidies are more effective in making rental housing affordable to low income. But what is very clear is demand-side subsidies don't induce more supply. So you can't choose between the two. In most cases, if you want to increase your supply, you need more of supply-side subsidies. I've given an example of the Kenya model, which is providing land, zeroizing that, and also the finance costs related with acquiring land, and also the infrastructure. In most cases, it really makes rental housing viable. Then I want to talk about the transition or the taking away of rental housing from informal markets to formal market. And I've really used cases. India is one of them. Morocco is also one of them. So there are 4 key elements. The first one is really to assess the rental sector. What is it that people are looking for in housing? The size, what are the typical size of families, the location. Someone spoke here about the transport costs that people are paying, then defeats the whole purpose of owning a house. And what we have actually done in our affordability calculator, Dr. Gambo did that as well, is transport cost is a major element in assessing rental affordability or housing affordability in general. Then the second one is address the legal and contractual framework. This is really transitioning from the rent controls to ensuring that rentals, especially for new build, is based on the market assessments or reference rental. Then conducive taxation system. One of the reasons why rental housing is very much prevalent in the informal sector is the landlords, so to say, various types. Big landlords, small, they are running away from taxation. So government needs to put a taxation framework that encourages, not punitive, but encourages formalization of rental housing. Because what is happening now is no one is looking at the conditions of rental housing. And because of that, we tend to have limited supply of decent rental housing because of landlords or investors trying to run away from those taxes. Then also the finance, I'll talk a bit around our lessons learned as South African Development Bank around, then I'll just focus on the legal framework. I think the first one, there's need to standardize, make it simple and very clear in terms of there's a dispute around rental. How best can we deal with those issues? Allow rent increases, it shouldn't be illegal. There is need to realize that it's an investment that someone is putting. They need a market rent to make that investment viable. Accelerate dispute resolution. This is one of the key issues. Promote arbitration, alternative dispute resolution. In general, the legal and regulatory system are needed to create processes that encourage investors. I'm told I'm running out of time. Then reduce tax rate. I think I've spoken about all these issues. And the idea here is to make sure that the taxes being charged for rental housing is comparable to other investment boutiques. To an extent, investors are also getting value from it. I'll just run through. This viral model is our diagnostic tool, which we deploy to countries to really understand the housing market in terms of also promoting rental housing. I'll not go item by item, but viral is short for vision, institutions, regulations, actors, and using an appreciative inquiry, what are the local initiatives as well. I think these slides will be shared. We will also be very much available to even share reports that we have done in terms of market size. We have also done. Then lastly, these are our products at South Africa, and under our financial institution group, you will see that we were also even promoting rent to own, but we have moved also to promote rental housing. And what are some of the lessons we have learned? The first one, adapt flexible and adaptable approaches to financing. So what we see is rental housing is more long-term. We have actually increased our tenors now to 12 years at most for rental housing. The idea is you need to allow for stabilization of the cash flows coming from the assets created. Then extend tenor of the loan, leverage public resources to to maximize impact. How are we doing it? We are structuring PPPs, ideally to capture the private sector, to create a framework that when the private sector like CPF, MERS here, they look at it, they are long-term, they should be willing to invest as well. It also de-risks rental housing. And also employer-assisted housing schemes where we partner with employers and they're actually paying the rentals for a certain period for their employees, thereby de-risking rental housing. I have run out of time. I hope to a certain extent I've managed to demystify rental housing. I hope I've managed to show where it started, governments trying to deflect responsibility, but this is really viable. 71% of Africans are living in rental housing, and we need to think again, like Adam Grant said, and say, how do we make it work in Africa? Thank you very much.